Chapter 11. The Snare. The torches were damp, but at last they managed to light one. The map, tightly rolled and secured, wrapped in Rowan's clothes during the swim, had survived. John and Marley crouched beside Rowan as he unrolled it and spread it out on his knees. The red lines continued upward, twisting and turning, and in the next blank space the verse Rowan had come to expect had appeared. Left or right, which will you take? For both of them your heart will break. One is cruel, one is fair, one a passage, one a snare. Choose the one that hides the light, and you will know your path is right. They all looked up at the huge stone face. The gleaming eyes still cast their reflections over the water, and now that they were directly below them, they could see that the eyes were hollow. They were entrances. To what? Which one was the door that led to the mountain top? Rowan bent his head to the map again. The outline gave no clue. There were no markings showing twin passages. The only clues were in the verse. We will look at both and decide, John said. But when they had climbed the rocky face and peered into its eyes, they found that both caves looked alike. The walls of both were gleaming with a strange white-blue fungus that shone in the dark. Both were roughly the same size and shape, though the left was slightly higher and wider than the right, and from both came the sighing, breathy sound. "What does it mean, one is cruel and one is fair?" demanded Marley. "They're both the same." "It says we should choose the one that hides the light," Rowan pointed out. "Perhaps we should try each of them in turn to see where the torch flickers and dies." Marley moved uncomfortably, shaking her damp hair from her eyes. "Agreed," said Strong John. "We will first try the right-hand side. Who knows but the last line of the verse is speaking the absolute truth, as it was in the swamp. It says your path is right. Perhaps it means just that." They held up their torch to Alan and watched him raise his in answer and turn away to begin the lonely journey back to the cave entrance. Then they crawled up into the right-hand passage. It curved immediately, then curved again, and Rowan soon lost his sense of direction. He could walk upright, but Marley and John had to bend their heads lightly, for the roof was low. They crept along, stumbling on the rocky floor, and the flame of the torch burned as brightly as ever. Then abruptly they came to a halt. In front of them, the cave-like passage narrowed into a low tunnel, barely large enough to crawl through. "That settles it," panted Marley. "A snare if I ever saw one. Now we try the left. It was too much to hope for straight advice from Shiva." The left-hand passage was easier to walk in. It was straight at first, and larger than the other, and its sandy floor was smooth. But again the flame of the torch did not flicker. They walked on, turning corner after corner, in increasingly puzzlement. The map had never failed them before. The sighing sound was louder now. It filled their ears and whispered around them. And Rowan could smell something, a smell like damp and mold and cold and thick darkness. At first he thought it was his imagination, or the glowing fungus on the walls. He rubbed his fingers over it and smelled them. No, the fungus smelled of nothing at all as far as he could tell. Strong John, who was leading, slowed, and finally stopped as the tunnel curved yet again. "Go on, John," called Marley impatiently. "The faster we go, the sooner we'll be out of here." "The tunnel is starting to go down quite steeply now," said John. "The walls are smooth with no handholds, and the sand will make it difficult for us to keep our feet." "I do not like this place," Rowan murmured. "It looks fair, as the rhyme said, but it feels of danger. One is cruel, one is fair, one a passage, one a snare." Fear fluttered in his chest. "Nonsense," Marley said. "We have no choice. The other way is blocked." "Not quite blocked," said John, turning to face her. "There is room to crawl. It would be a cruel journey, but perhaps the way after all. The verse, remember, rhymes fair with snare, and I agree with Rowan. This place smells of death." "You're both absurd," breathing in short, shallow gasps. Marley pushed past Rowan. She grabbed the flaming torch from John and darted around him, took 2 steps, and slipped. She scrabbled in the shifting sand, trying to rise, while the torch tumbled away from her down the slope, bouncing and turning. Then it fell over the terrible drop that lay at the end of the tunnel, fell and fell, while Marley screamed. It hit bottom finally with a sickening crack. They pulled Marley up after them as they scrambled out of the tunnel, almost running, their hearts beating wildly at the thought of the fate they had barely escaped. 1 minute more, half a minute, and they too would have tumbled helplessly to their deaths over that underground cliff. Stumbling around in the last bend, they fell on their knees at the tunnel entrance. Marley was shaking. I am sorry, she said over and over. Rowan, too, was trembling. Strong John's weather-beaten face was drawn, but he roused himself with an effort. "Looking on the bright side, as Alan would say," he said, trying to smile. "At least we know now that the right-hand passage must indeed be the way. The tunnel is narrow, but if we leave our packs behind and take only what we can carry in our pockets, we can do it. We will have to crawl and pray that it is not too long." Rowan swallowed, thinking of the cramped dark hole that he had seen in the right-hand cave. The idea of creeping into it without any idea of where he was going or when the ordeal would end was frightful. The red line on the map had been long, very long, but he said nothing. The other way had been a snare indeed. It had nearly killed them. If they were to reach the mountain top, they were going to have to crawl. So be it. They lit another torch and edged across the right-hand passage. They entered it and followed its sharp bend as before, cutting themselves off immediately from the sight of the gleaming pool. Rowan drew a breath as he realized the truth. Choose the one that hides the light. This was the light the verse had meant. Not the torchlight as they had thought, but the reflected light of the pool, cut off from their view by the turning of the right-hand tunnel, but clearly visible for minutes in the straight, fair left. They had misunderstood the words again. Choose the one that hides the light, and you will know your path is right. The answer had been there, twice, clear for all of them to see, and still they had blundered. When they reached the place where the passage narrowed, John, Marley, and Rowan opened their packs and began transferring the most important of their possessions to their pockets, and winding rope around their waists. It was clear that no baggage would fit through that tiny hole. As it was, Strong John and Marley would almost totally fill the space, and crawling would be slow and uncomfortable with no turning back. "Before we begin, we will eat," said John, pointing at the food they had discarded. "We do not know when we will have another chance." Rowan squatted on the ground and began nibbling at some bread and cheese. His stomach was empty, but it was churning too, from fear and the bitter water he had swallowed in the black pool. He thought he had never enjoyed a meal less. Marley crouched over her pack, breathing hard. She ignored the food John offered her. Rowan wondered whether she was ill. She had not seemed herself since they entered the caverns, except for the brief time when they were swimming. And now she was obviously in distress. Sweat was breaking out on her forehead, and she bit her lips as she pulled out her sleeping blanket and cast it aside with shaking fingers. "Marley." Strong John's voice was low. She stiffened, but did not raise her head. "Marley," he said again. "It is the tunnel, is it not? It is the smallness of the tunnel that worries you?" "I am not afraid," said Marley loudly, but still she did not look up. "Once we begin, Marley, there will be no turning back," John said. "If you feel you cannot do this, you should say so now. You have been uneasy ever since we entered the caverns. We have all seen that. You fear enclosed spaces." "I do not. I am not afraid," Marley said again, but her voice was thick. She threw back her head and looked John in the eye. She was quivering with fear and tension. "I am ready," she said. "Let us begin." She walked to the narrow opening and threw herself onto the ground. Slowly she began to wriggle into the tunnel. They watched her head and shoulders disappear into the gloom, then her body, then her legs and feet. They felt her agony of mind as if it were a living thing, but they could do nothing but wait. Only when at last her strength broke, and she began to scream and gasp and cry out to them and beat on the rocky walls, could they act. Only then could they pull her from the suffocating prison her fear had made and help her breathe again and still her cries. "I thought I could defeat it," she sobbed. "I was sure that this time, for such an important task, I could do it. But it overwhelms me, John, as it always has." She buried her face in her hands. "It's all right, Marley. Marley, be still," soothed John. "I do not like any shut-in place," Marley whispered. "But when I cannot lift my head and shoulders, when I cannot move my arms freely, it is as if I cannot breathe. I could not even wrap myself tightly in a blanket for fear of it." She lifted her head and gulped at the air. "So I saw last night," said John, smiling. "I thought perhaps you did not feel the cold." "I nearly froze," Marley managed to answer a smile. "John, I am so sorry. And Rowan." "What will we do now?" "We will do what must be done," said John simply. "I will continue. You have a compass. Rowan has the map. You two will join Alan and together make your way back to Rin. If you follow the way we came, with every care and remember." Marley stared at him in horror. "But you cannot go alone. John, you cannot." "Marley, I must. You know I must." "No!" Rowan heard his own voice, loud in the echoing space of the cave. He could feel his face burning. "You cannot send me home. I have the map. You need the map. There are 2 blank spaces left, 2 verses of warning still to come. You need to know what they are, Strong John. You must take me with you." "I cannot do that, Rowan." John shook his head. "I will not go back," cried Rowan. "You cannot make me." He ran over to the narrow passage entrance and sat down in front of it. I must hold the map for you, he said. I must find the water for the bookshop. I promised them. He set his chin. John stared back at him in helpless silence. Marley half smiled. It seems you have met your match, Strong John. With the son as well as the mother. She regarded Rowan curiously. Who would have thought it? John hesitated, then gave in. Very well, he sighed. So what will be, and Sheba is to have her way. He put a big hand on Marley's shoulder. Goodbye, Marley, and good luck on your journey home. Remember all we have learned. This time you will face the dangers well prepared. You will survive. Tell Alan that we four will meet again in Rin. In 2 strides he was at Rowan's side. Come then, before either of us changes his mind, Skinny Rabbit. You first. Take care, called Marley as they disappeared into the tunnel. Take care, Strong John and Rowan of the bookshop. Her voice echoed in the cave behind them, then faded into silence. Now, thought Rowan in the darkness, we are 2.